I told you we were going to do something about Angela, and I think I'll do it at the next conference because of something that happened at the table this morning when we were eating. I think I'm going to talk on reconciliation. No, so I decided I would do Francis and Clare because I was talking a little bit about the theology behind Francis's view of nature, and it seemed important to the individual, so I'm going to include that as part of the thing. But we'll begin with Francis. There are probably few saints in the Catholic Church whose history and everything is better known than Francis. Just, you know, he's a great subject for movies, and one of the interesting things to me, I was in Spreckles when I was pastor there. I was traveling in Croatia, I think, and the real start of the Reformation, most people don't know this, was a reformer in the city of Prague, and his name was Huss. And Huss was the very first person to react against the church. So we burned him at the stake. And later on then, you had people like Luther and that come up. But anyway, he's basically the founder of the Baptists because he believed that there should be no creed. You believe everything the Bible says, and that's it. You know, that's all you need. You don't need a creed. And so Baptists don't have a creed, and that's why every Baptist church really is kind of independent. But anyway, so while I was there, I bought a statue of, I wanted to get a statue, rather, of John Huss for a Baptist friend of mine in Spreckles. So I hunted all around. I couldn't find one. So when I got back to Spreckles, I told the guy that I really wanted you to get you this statue of Huss because you know, that's sort of the thing we do. And he says, well, we Baptists don't do statues. And so that's why you don't find statues around. But he says, we have one statue at our church. And I said, oh? So he took me over to his Baptist church outside, and they had one statue. It was Francis, and it was in their garden. Okay? Francis is kind of universal. Everyone, you know, gets Francis. So anyway, Francis, as you know, had very wealthy parents. One of the things you will discover in the history of saints, if you look at them, any saint who is a saint for poverty comes from a wealthy family. Any saint who's a saint of poverty will come from a wealthy family. Because one of the great privileges of being a wealthy person, you know money won't make you happy. The rest of us suspect it just might, you know. But once you've actually been wealthy, then you know that money won't make you happy. So all these people come from wealthy families. Francis was a very poor student, and so he got out of his education very quickly. If you're wealthy, you can do that. You don't need to earn the money anyway. And he was known in town as the wealthy king of frolic. So he gave himself to what all of us would do if we were rich and young. And Francis joined the army, and the little villages in Italy were always at war with one another. He was very seriously injured, and during the period, he was taken as a prisoner, and he was prisoner for over a year, and he returned home very, very sick, and they, you know, brought him out of the sickness. When he came out of the sickness, he came out with this unbelievable relationship with God. That was what he was about, was God. And if you're a father, like his father was, and you have a very brilliant son, Francis was a brilliant man. A lot of people who are brilliant aren't good students. But anyway, Francis was a very brilliant man, and you look to what he can do for your business, and you are not overly pleased if he decides to become the patron saint of poverty. That's the last thing you want for a wealthy son. So Francis and his father were at odds. And finally, Francis just left, as you know, left the money behind and everything, and went off and began to live a life of complete poverty. And for the rest of his life, he was in a contest to see how little he could get along with. And I don't know if you know the circumstances of his death, but when he was dying, he was, in one of the Franciscan houses that are not rich houses. So he's in the Franciscan house, and he asked to be taken outside. So they take him outside. He asks them to take off all his clothes. So they take off all his clothes. He asks them to lay them out on the dirt and let me die here in the poverty that I hoped one day to achieve. And that's how he died, So Francis began this life of poverty, and he had a vision. And when we talk about a lot of these people, early visions, you don't know whether it's a vision or a dream. I think a lot of us have dreams, and you aren't really sure you're awake or asleep or this sort of thing. But anyway, his vision was God was coming to him, and he was saying, repair my house, repair my house. Well, there was a little mission in the valley beside Francis called San Damiano. And so Francis went down and began to repair this old chapel. And he got the old chapel repaired. And he began to have people join him. And a lot of people gathered around him, and he realized he was going to have to do something with regards to organizing it. So he went to Rome to get approval of the Pope. And the Pope was not overly excited about Francis. I don't know if you know the popes at that particular time, but they knew what money was about, That's about, it's not too long after that where St. Peter's Basilica is built. And the building of St. Peter's Basilica and everything that was involved is what brought about the Reformation. And that was the end of that accumulation of wealth by the papacy and everything. So anyway, he's not really enthusiastic about Francis, but he goes to bed one night and he has a dream. And in the dream, he sees the church sort of collapsing and St. Francis is holding it up. Now, I think it's really interesting that when Francis heard God say, repair my church, he thought he meant a building. That wasn't what God meant at all. And when the Pope saw Francis holding up a building, it wasn't just a building at all. It's thanks to the Franciscans that we as a church survived the Reformation, because they're the one group in the church that were really standing against this massive use of authority and money and all that sort of stuff. But Francis held the church, the Franciscans held the church together through the Reformation. And so that's what really God was about. And so when the Pope had this dream, he approved Francis, and Francis went back. And he went on and accomplished his work. He met St. Dominic. He and Dominic founded a brand new type of religious order. Before that time, everyone was a monk in a monastery. One of the rules of a monastery, and Vatican II sort of did away with this rule, but one of the rules of a monastery was if you join a monastery, you actually join that monastery. Like if you become a Benedictine, you are a Benedictine in that monastery. And one of the rules is you must sleep in that monastery every night. Okay? Well, that inhibited travel and this sort of thing. Well, Francis and St. Dominic, who were friends, started a whole new idea of order. And their order is that you must sleep in a Franciscan house or a Dominican house. They're called friars, so you can travel. So if you know the history of Father Serra, when he came to California, they say all the missions are one day apart. Yes, because you had to spend the night in a Franciscan house. So you moved from house to house this way, okay? So they were founded. And Francis then had this, but one of the things about Francis was he had an amazing relationship with nature. And if you're familiar with Paul, I tried to look up the text. I can quote the text for you, but I don't remember, to cite it by number. And one of the generous brothers at the table pointed out to me, if I was a Protestant minister, I'd know that. But anyway, back to the reconciliation. But anyway, the business about the text. Paul writes, he says that all of creation groans awaiting salvation. Okay? He talks about all of creation groaning, awaiting salvation. And in the theology behind Francis's thinking is that what happened, we have God and we have Adam. Okay, and we have this relationship between God and Adam. And the relationship between God and people was broken by the sin of Adam. So this whole thing collapses. So what do we have to do is draw it together. And how do we draw it together? Well, the first thing we do is we have to get us related with God. So that's accomplished by Jesus, who is a human being and God. So he's able to unite us this way. But now that has got to be extended to creation that is at odds with us as we were at odds with God. And so how is that accomplished? And that has to be accomplished through individuals. And like what I would tell you is, this may sound crazy to you, except if I encourage you to try it for a few days, you'll be amazed at how it changes you, okay? We have the ability to redeem creation in the same way Jesus Christ redeemed us. You and I, in a real sense, are the priests of creation, and we can extend it. And the way we do it is by giving nature its proper role in reference to this structure. Like my proper role in my relationship to God is obedience to God's teaching and God's leadership. Nature's proper role is to inspire me to God, so that when I look at nature, if it turns my mind to God, then I have redeemed that nature, or that nature has been redeemed. It enters its proper role. And you know where we find this? In the Psalms, where, the whole Psalms are, someone looks up at the stars and says, about the wonderful things of the stars, or the beauty of nature, or the animals, and the whole thing is that nature is to turn me to God. And to the degree nature turns me to God, that nature is redeemed. And I see this in a very, a very tactical way. So that, like, for instance, if a flower blooms in the desert and no human being ever sees it, or no believer ever sees it, it's gone. But if you have a rose bloom in your yard and you step out and you look and you say, what a magnificent rose, only God could do something like that. Or you have the smell of the rose from whatever it comes. Let's say this flower in the desert, some character, takes it and takes the scent out of it, creates a perfume. Your wife's wearing the perfume. You smell it and you think, my God, this is an absolute amazing thing. This must come from God. That flower has been redeemed. The redemption in nature is found by its turning us to God. And if you and I, when I step out the front door, if I make it a point that I am going consciously to redeem nature by constantly turning to God, by what I see, by what I hear, you listen to a bird sing, it's an amazing power to be able to look out and say, that flower will be forever, that bird will live forever, all this. Imagine your pets, Imagine this amazing ability to extend everlasting life that Jesus has given us to the nature in which we live. And that's how Francis got this thing of nature. Like, Francis would step out of his house in the morning, and it would be his purpose to redeem as much of this world as possible, whether we're talking mountains, trees, plants, anything. And this thing, he saw that thing, remember where Jesus says, go forth, preach the gospel to all creatures. And how do you preach the gospel to creatures? Not necessarily by talking to them, by allowing them to relate us to God. Okay? So this is the thing of how it works with Francis with regards to nature. Okay? Now, another side of Francis is the saint that he was connected with, which is Clare. Clare was a daughter from a very wealthy family. In fact, she's from Roman nobility. And she heard Francis preach just once. She was a very religious young lady, and when she heard Francis preach, she really was moved by it and had this call that Francis had to poverty and everything. And so she made an appointment with Francis and told Francis that she was interested in pursuing that kind of life and everything. And Francis promptly cut off all her hair, which to me is a bad date. But anyway, so he cut off her hair, and she started the life. But the interesting thing about her, this is very early. We're talking the 1200s. She died in 1253, Francis in 1226. In the 1200s, the church was very protective of women. And for instance, if you were a woman, you could not have a job outside your home. Okay, you could have a job, women did sewing, but you could not have a job outside your home. The way the Catholic Church looked at women in the early days, you'd find out is very similar to the way Muslims view them today, that they were ultra protective with them, okay? And so the Pope would allow a woman to found a monastery, or a woman to have a monastery of nuns, but they couldn't do anything outside it. They had to stay in the monastery. That would be their home, so they could work in their home. They could have people come in for classes or something like that, but they had to stay in the monastery. So that's what Clare did. And the very interesting thing is, Clare really had exactly the same vocation that Francis did. But Clare lived in a time in the church when that wasn't possible, And I think one of the things you discover in the lives of saints, if you look through, that oftentimes the saints are what moved the church. Like, for instance, it's people who have this strong call to something that the church kind of prohibits, who become so holy in being about what they would like to do, the church begins to think, maybe they were right. And the church changes. That's what we do with ecumenical councils. We look at things like that, and it causes the church to change. But the wonderful thing about Francis was able to look at Clare and to give her life the meaning that she couldn't find, the church would not allow her to go into. And Francis told her, he said, "You pray for me, and everything I do will be the work of your prayer, so that I can go out and redeem the tree, but it's by your prayers that it happened." And so she became, in her mind and in Francis's, the engine behind Francis's life. And Francis saw her as this great power of prayer in the background. And I don't know if you know much about the story of Clare herself, but I'll give you two examples. At that time in history, I think you know there were these raging, attacks out of the Orient. People like Attila the Hun and stuff like that came out of the Orient and would ravish whole sections of Europe until they kind of dissipated. And twice armies like that approached Assisi, and both times it was Clare who stopped them. That she simply went out, and once with the Blessed Sacrament, and once alone. Just this whole city's, everyone's terrified in it, it's all locked up, and this girl walks out of the front of the thing and tells the general to go home. And he does, So, but this great power that she had, and this power Francis allowed to be in his life. But I think that were it not for Francis doing that, she would never have felt fulfillment in her own life, because the church didn't allow kind of the vocation she was called to. And at the same time, it empowered Francis. And Francis had this sense that he was gathering the entire universe to God. I was with a Franciscan friend one time. He was a seminarian, and of course, in the Franciscans, you're imbued with all this stuff. So we were camping actually in the Olympic National Park, and we looked up and we saw a shooting star. It was that period where you have that, all of them. So we saw the shooting star went clear across and it went out. I said, "It's gone." He says, "No, it isn't." Because he said, "I redeemed it while it was moving." That star is never going to stop moving. And this, but I cannot tell you, try it in your own life, the sense it gives you of power, the sense of this amazing ability to extend God to nature and stuff. And you know, it's easier extending it to nature, but then it will work in your own life to allow you to extend God to people. Like you will feel empowered by that in how you extend God to people. And the extending God to people, as we talked at last time, you know, it isn't so much preachers. There are not many people who are converted by preachers. People are converted by kindness. Like I see myself as a preacher. My job is to educate your faith. My job's not to give you faith. Some person's example has caused God to activate faith in you. That's where faith comes from. Faith comes from God and God alone. But when that faith is activated, then it needs to be educated. It needs to be nourished. Now, my job's education. There are people who are nourished it. There's all kinds of things in the thing. But this whole idea that you and I can extend the kingdom of God, I think one of the great powers of Satan is to convince us that jobs are so big they can't be done. Like, for instance, you and I look at how corrupt the society in which we're living is. And we looked at this corruption, and you think it's absolutely hopeless. And can you correct this? No, you can't. But we can. And that's the whole thing. God asks you to extend the faith to a certain number of people, to a certain amount of creation, and ultimately, should you end up a saint, the church will use your example to change the way the church is historically. That's where we're called to be. You know, you think of me, I'll just use my own example. I have a great education, but I am a terrible dyslexic. I can hardly spell. I go through a whole bunch of things. I had polio as a child. I was in the hospital for a year, and I have a mild miscoordination because of that. It doesn't come from my drinking. It's the it comes from the polio stuff. And I'd go through a whole list of all these things. And I told you one time I went to a counselor in the seminary because I was very concerned about my grades and all that stuff. And I was just really down, so I went to see him. And he says, "Well, how would you, what do you wish you were?" And he says, "Why don't you design exactly what you want?" So I designed it, you know, taller, better looking, richer, brighter. This guy was so close to God, it was disgusting. But anyway, I put the whole thing together, and I went into the priest, and he said, "What's the difference between the two?" And I said, "You've got it written right in your hand." And he says, no, what's the real difference? Well, I said, the real difference is I'm here and he isn't. He says, "Do you know why?" And I said, "Well, I'd never thought about it." He says, "You've studied dogmatic theology," because I was in the seminary. He says, "You tell me why you're here and he isn't. And I'm here because God loves me, and he isn't because God didn't love him." And he says, "It's interesting that what bothers you about you somehow excites God. And that's why you're here." And he says, "It's your job to extend the faith to people and to extend salvation to creation. and you'll do a very good job of it, whether you know it or not. Now get out there and do it. It's just that simple, you know? And I think we all underestimate ourselves. That's one of the wonderful things when you fall in love. When you fall in love with any person, you enable them to see themselves the way they are. But until someone falls in love with you, you never really understand who you are. You see all these different things. But once you really fall in love with a person, you can understand why this particular combination appeals to God. Like, you can't look at any person and argue why someone's in love with them. That's absurd. It's something unique that happens, and that's what happens with us and God, that there's something about us that turns God on, and that's why we exist. And I oftentimes, when I talk about this, I oftentimes remind people that when I get to God for judgment, I'm very curious why he was never turned on by unicorns, but he was by mosquitoes. What the hell's going on with that, you know? But anyway, this idea of somehow standing before God and seeing this as our call. Francis and Claire together formed a really strong unit. And again, Claire was limited by the church, and it's unfortunate. I wonder what Claire would have been had she been allowed to do what but together, they did exactly what God called them to do. And again, you notice it's a pair. Holiness never takes place alone. Sometimes you know the other person, sometimes you don't, but holiness cannot take place alone. And that's because I think sometimes we forget even God is a community. 3 persons. We're the only religion in the whole world that holds that God himself is a community. And as people who grow, it's community in which we grow. Okay, and we'll deal with Angela at the next one. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. We'll take a moment, see if anyone has any questions. Yep.
Father, I saw and I don't know if you've seen the movie, I saw it in college, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. You ever heard of that?
By the what?
Brother, Sun, Sister.
Oh, yes, yes.
Now, it was just a Hollywood production, I guess, but is there any truth or any accuracy in that movie?
Oh, yes. Yes, remember it begins with the illness. You know, it doesn't show him in war, but it begins with the illness and explains the relationship that he had with Claire. I think had they not been, you know, involved in the church in celibacy, I think they ultimately would have been a married couple. They were really in love with God, and their love with God, you know, bonded them. But no, the movie is very accurate. Yeah. Yeah. There are a couple movies about, you know, most people, when you do a biography, you have to flower it up to make it interesting. You don't with Frank, you know. Anyone else? Go ahead.
This goes back a long way, but how did the whole sort of sainthood process get started in the first place?
Okay. When you die, a group of us would decide that you've lived a life holy enough that you should be a saint. Now, we'll admit, of course, we're all crazy. But anyway, we bring your name before the authorities in Rome. And so what they would do is allow us to talk about you, you know, in the area. And if a devotion builds up, then when they would begin to examine your life itself, then comes the hard part. It's a trial. That there's a devil's advocate, and it's his job to make sure you don't get canonized. He would point out everything wrong with you, okay? A very busy man. And then one of us would be appointed to find everything exceptionally holy with you, which of course is an easier job, okay? So we do this. And then we actually have a court case. There's an actual court case. And because, you know, when we're talking about canonization, we aren't talking about holiness. Remember I told you that we believe in the church that, our salvation is from Jesus Christ, okay? And that salvation comes to us. So we are not talking about whether or not you're saved. That's not the issue. The issue is your life an example for other people? And if it is an example for other people, then you end up canonized, okay? So they examine your life in that way. But that's basically it. It's a relatively long process, normally, although saints have been canonized like this recently. When I go through the Ordo, because they list the saints, for each day, probably 1/3 of all the saints that we go through in the year have lived in my lifetime. Now, you have to remember, I was a child during Nazi Germany, and a lot of saints came out of Nazi Germany. So, but just a lot of them, But they look to those things, and then they examine. But I think as a kid, I sort of had this idea that, the saints were in heaven, and the rest of us, I guess, went to purgatory if we didn't go to hell, okay? But only the saints were heaven. That's not, the church has never taught that, okay? The presumption is you're going to heaven. That's the presumption. And we work towards that, hopefully, we grow in holiness, all this sort of thing. But a saint is not just a holy person who went to heaven. It's a person whose life can be used as an example by other people. Does that answer it? Okay. Anything else? Go ahead.
When you said we can redeem creation by reverting back to its rule, is it just through appreciation, or is it through like an act that you have to do to help it go into its natural role? Like how do you let nature go back to its rule?
Oh, you have to understand all of this structure has to do with the proper role. And what is the proper role of nature in this structure? The proper role of nature is to raise my mind to God. And you find that in the Psalms. The Psalms are all full of how nature has moved people to God. And so what nature does, that's nature's job. And if you and I will consciously let nature do that, and you have to do it consciously, depending on how interested in nature you are, you have to do it consciously for a little while. I had to do it. I love collecting rocks, collecting things, so it didn't take me long. But some people it'll take longer. But once you get into it, you can't look at anything without thinking of God. You can't smell anything without thinking of God. You can't taste anything without thinking of God. You've allowed this world to do what it was created to do. Okay? And that's what you do with nature. But I think it has to be done consciously at the beginning. You reach a point where it's unconscious. Like everything moves you to God.
Could the same be said about art?
Absolutely. Anything. See, that you're talking creation. Anything that's created can do that. Okay? And the universe is divided into created and uncreated. Uncreated is God and everything else created. Okay? Go ahead.
I'm just curious, we're very fortunate this year that we have several young people. And I guess as a father, I look at my kids and social media and their phones and all this stuff. And the idea of partnering up. I had friends that I really connected with from a young age, and we kind of pushed each other and prayed together and could share things. Any advice or ideas for young people who are feeling just kind of this call, or not such a call like the priesthood, but just this God is doing something in my life, and how do I nurture that? Or,
Yeah.
I don't know.
See, I'm going to tell you the problem. Would to God I could tell you the solution. But one of the problems today, and I notice it like in the family that I'm living with, my daughter-in-law is a forensic pathologist. My son is now retired, but had been founded a couple of high schools for what do you call it? Exceptional children. He has his degree in educating exceptional children. And I have the one grandson. Now, the four of us live in the home. But it's very interesting that we will be sometimes in the evening in the TV room, and I look around, and the little boy is playing games on his cell phone. His mother, she's a forensic pathologist. They have nothing but money. You have no idea how much they make. But she spends all her time, all her free time, is buying things online. So she's buying these things online. My son is probably watching the sports on TV because they're all sports. And I'm not interested in the sports, but I'm sort of interested in being with them, present. But there's no interrelationship. And if I were to take his son, I bet the only time he's with other people is in a classroom when they're relating to teachers. But kids don't have the friendships that we had. You know, like in the neighborhood, we used to go out and, you know, play ball in the street, or we'd go hiking together. No, they're gaming at a computer. And I want you to know that dividing people one from another is a satanic work that ultimately works against us, you know? And that's why, like all over the world today, look at the divisions that are going up. And the divisions are going up because people don't know one another, okay? Like, I live in I don't know about your area, I live in an area where the division between the pro-Trump and anti-Trump people is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. It's even more terrifying when you know the anti-Trump people have as many guns as the pro-Trump people, okay? They all do, okay? They're all armed. Some of them are quiet, but they're all armed, okay? But it's dangerous. Our society is disintegrating. It's disintegrating, but it's not just us. That's universal. Now, I wish I could give you a solution. I drink. I don't know how you'd find it, but okay. Anything else? Go ahead.
You mentioned that God is a community as well, that we are in a religion that's the only religion where God is a community, but at the same time we believe that God is one. I always wondered, how do you explain that to someone who doesn't have no clue what the Trinity is? How do you explain to them that God is one but also three?
One of the things that we hold is that ultimately is a mystery that cannot be explained. And that's not the point at which to start people who want to enter religion. I think over a period of time, as a believer, you sort of graduate into the faith. And when you graduate into faith, you reach a point where when God says something, that's enough. That's not where it starts. And you have to come to the Trinity where God says it. Because and I'll tell you the key to the Trinity. I'm surprised you very seldom hear it from the pulpit. Do you know that in Jesus' day, they never could say the name of God? You were forbidden to say the name of God. And if you were to go into an Orthodox synagogue today, a very conservative synagogue, the first line of Genesis is, "In the beginning, Yahweh created heaven and earth." But if an Orthodox rabbi picks it up, he'll say, "In the beginning, the name created heaven and earth." Okay? You never speak it, but as soon as you say the name, you know what they mean. Think of the text you see in Scripture, "Hallowed be your name." What does it mean, hallowed be your name? It means holy is God, you know? Or bless the name of the Lord. Bless God, you know? It's just they didn't say the name. Well, think of the baptismal formula. Go forward and baptize them in the name. So you baptize them in God, Father, Son, and Spirit. Now, if that weren't that true, what he would have said is, baptize them in the names of the Father, Son, and Spirit. So he says, you baptize them in God, who is the three persons. Okay, so that's the text that explains it. But I don't think that appeals to someone who hasn't come to a certain level of faith. So the interesting thing about the Bible, if you read the scriptures, particularly in Paul, we constantly talk about the mystery of God. And the key thing to a mystery, I don't know what you people have studied, but any true fact is a mystery. So if you study, let's say you study physics, if you're just beginning the subject of physics, you have a bunch of questions. If you go to someone who has a doctorate in physics, he will know 100,000 times more than I know, but he'll have 100,000 more questions than I do, because a true fact is always a mystery, and it expands as you go into it. And God's that sort of thing. But you know, the scriptures never describe the mysteries of Satan. If you look in Revelation, it's the secrets of Satan. Secrets sound a lot like mysteries, but they aren't. Secrets are just unknown. Once you know the secret, it's over. Satan has nothing but secrets. God has nothing but mysteries. Okay. Anything else? I was going to call on you earlier when I mentioned about that text in Scripture. Did you know the text? I saw your lips move. See, nothing is safe. I'm a teacher. I see everything. What's the text?
I believe it's Romans.
Romans?
8:24 or 22.
Yeah.
Would you sit down and be quiet? 8:22? Yeah, you might look it up then. 8:22. Okay? Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.